the most remarkable aspects of the novel Frankenstein is the creature's own narrative. In Mary Shelley's complex nested narratives, we've already encountered Walton's first-person epistolary narrative, and then within that, Victor Frankenstein's first-person narrative. And then here, at the center of the novel, comes the creature telling his own story. In the beginning, just after his creation, the creature understands very little. Mary Shelley is clearly drawing here on John Locke's empiricist theory about how we acquire our ideas. He believes that each person comes into this world as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that we acquire ideas through experience, initially through our sensations. This is a passage from his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Every man being conscious to himself that he thinks, and that which his mind is applied about while thinking being ideas, it is passed out that men have in their mind several ideas, such as those expressed by the words whiteness, motion, thinking. How does he come by them? Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, blank slate, or tabula rasa, void of all characters, without any ideas. Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? From experience. Our senses, conversant about particular sensible objects, do convey into the mind several distinct perception of things according to these various ways wherein those objects do affect them. Yellow, white, heat, cold. This great source of most of the ideas, whatever it is in the mind can be employed about in thinking, we have, depending wholly upon our senses, I call sensation. Now here's Shelley's account of the creature's early days. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of various senses. By degrees, I remember, a stronger light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me, but hardly had I felt this when, by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me again. I walked, and I believe descended, but I presently found a great alteration in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but I now found that I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked, I sought a place where I could receive shade. Gradually, as Locke theorizes, the creature is able to organize and make sense of his sensations. Then he learns language and even reading by listening in on Safi's English lessons. But the most significant stage of his education involves 3 books that he comes across. The first he reads is The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. Now, this is a proto-romantic epistolary novel about a young man who falls deeply in love with a woman who's already engaged to be married and later in the novel does marry. And the novel tells the story of this infatuation, which grows deeper and deeper and finally ends in his suicide. This was an immensely popular novel. It sparked what people called Werther fever and, in fact, inspired copycat suicides, young men throwing themselves off bridges throughout Europe. Now, when the creature reads this, he's profoundly moved by the picture of, and these are his words, gentle and domestic manners and lofty sentiments and feeling. And he seems to identify with Werther, whose love was rejected, just as his love will be rejected. But the creature also feels alienated from the human race as he reads this novel. I sympathized with and partly understood them, that is, the characters, but I was unformed in mind, I was dependent on none and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? The second book is Plutarch's Lives. The whole title is Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans. This is an ancient book by a Greek historian, and it tells the stories of famous men of the ancient world, but it's really a moral text. It emphasizes their moral virtues or moral failings. The creature's reaction to this one is to get stronger ideas about virtue and vice. The volume of Plutarch's Lives which I possessed contained the histories of the first founders of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me from the sorrows of Werther. I learned from Werther's imaginations despondency and gloom, but Plutarch taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections to admire and love the heroes of past ages. The cottage of my protectors had been the only school in which I had studied human nature, but this book developed new and mightier scenes of action. I read of men concerned in public affairs, governing or massacring their species. I felt the greatest ardor for virtue rise within me, an abhorrence for vice, as far as I understood the signification of those terms. But the most important text for Frankenstein is Milton's Paradise Lost, one of the great works of English literature. Paradise Lost is an epic poem which retells the biblical story of the creation of Adam and Eve and the fall of man. But much of the poem is devoted not directly to telling the fall of man, but telling the story of Satan's fall, which in turn causes the fall of humankind because Satan will tempt Eve. An angel, Satan leads the rebel angels against God, whom he sees as a tyrant. Satan is, of course, defeated and thrown into hell, but he continues defiant. This is Satan speaking in the first book. A mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The Romantics admired the character of Satan in Paradise Lost. They admired his opposition to tyranny, which they linked to the revolutionary fervor of the time, and also his heroic attitude in the face of defeat. In fact, Blake claims in his book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. In other words, Milton was writing in favor of Satan, even though he thought himself writing in favor of God. This wasn't quite right, but it was a very important misreading. As the epic continues, Satan gradually realizes that hell is really a state of mind. Me miserable, which way shall I fly? Infinite wrath and infinite despair. Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell. And when he loses hope, he chooses to embrace evil. So farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost. Evil be thou my good. So envious of the happiness of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and unable to attack God directly, Satan decides to hurt God through his creatures by tempting Eve and causing the fall of man and mankind's alienation from God. Paradise Lost is central to Mary Shelley's themes in Frankenstein. First, we have the epigraph. Now, an epigraph is a quotation that appears at the start of a novel, or sometimes a poem, or even at the start of a chapter of a novel. You may have missed this. This was on the title page. But this is the epigraph of Frankenstein, and it's the words of Adam after the fall. He's speaking to God. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Clearly, this reflects the creature's attitude towards his own creation. But we also have Victor, the creature's the creature's reaction to reading Paradise Lost. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations, as their similarity struck me, to my own. Like Adam, I was created apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Victor Frankenstein has chosen to take on the identity of the Creator. But the creature faces a constant conflict of identity. Is he like Adam, the only creature of his kind, with no relationship in the world except to his Creator? This inspires his request that Victor create for him a mate, an Eve, as God did for Adam. But perhaps he's more like Satan, driven by a desire for revenge against the Creator, who has rejected him, and by envy of the happiness of ordinary human beings. Perhaps he, like Satan, will choose to say, "Evil, be thou my good."